Montana, January 1948, 38 below zero, the kind of cold that doesn't move, it just waits. Flathead Valley lies buried under a sky the color of iron. Snow fields stretch for miles in every direction, silent, still, absolute. Nothing stirs. Even the wind has gone somewhere else. A cluster of rooftops appears in the distance, chimneys, every single one pumping thick, dark smoke into the frozen air. Desperate smoke, the smoke of fires burning too hard, too fast, against something that cannot be outrun. Every chimney, except one thin thread, pale, steady, rising from a strange curved structure at the end of a snow-covered track, a steel shell wrapped around something like cupped hands protecting a flame. Inside that house, a 9-year-old boy is doing his homework, in his socks. No coat, no blanket, just a flannel shirt and the unhurried posture of a child who is not cold. Outside 38 below, inside 63 degrees, and nobody in the valley can explain why. Montana, November 1947. The cold came before the calendar said it should. It always did out here, but this year it had an edge to it, something personal, like it had decided specifically to make an example of the Flathead Valley. Valdis Morrow felt it in her knees first, then her hands, then in the particular silence of the house at 3 in the morning when the fire had burned itself down to nothing, and the walls were doing that thing walls do in deep cold, not creaking, not groaning, just pulling inward, contracting, like the whole structure was flinching. She was already awake. She was always already awake. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence and counted how long it would take for the temperature in the room to drop another 5 degrees. She had gotten good at this over the past year, good at measuring cold the way other women measured flour, by feel, by the particular quality of the air against her face, by the way the blanket above her had started to feel like a fact instead of a comfort. The sound came from down the hall, small, rhythmic, the kind of coughing that starts quiet and means to get louder. She was out of the bed before she finished the thought. Milo was 9 years old, and he slept the way small boys sleep, sideways, diagonal, taking up 3 times the space his body should require, except not now. Now he was curled tight at the edge of the mattress knees to chest, coughing into the collar of his wool coat because he had learned without anyone telling him that sleeping in the coat was warmer than sleeping without it. A 9-year-old should not know that. Valdis sat on the edge of his bed. She put her hand on his back, felt the small machinery of his lungs working harder than they should. "Hey," she said quietly. He didn't wake up, just coughed again once and then settled. She sat there in the dark and did not move. The thermometer on the wall read 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That was inside the house. She knew without looking what it was outside. She had checked before bed. 14 below. The kind of cold that doesn't feel like cold anymore. It feels like pressure, like the air itself is pushing back against you personally with the particular patience of something that has nowhere else to be. Valdis was 47 years old. She had lived in Montana for 19 of those years. She had weathered winters that killed livestock and split fence posts and turned the creek behind the property into a shelf of gray ice so thick you could walk across it. She knew cold. She respected it. But sitting on the edge of Milo's bed in that 38-degree room, she felt something she had never quite felt before. Not fear, sharper than fear, the specific clarifying terror of a woman who has done everything right and still cannot get it warm enough. The cabin was solid, 12-inch spruce logs notched and fitted by Orland's hands over the summer of 1943. Fieldstone foundation, steep pitched roof, good work, real work, the kind of work that should mean something in January. And it did mean something. It meant they weren't in a tent, weren't in a drafty frame house, weren't exposed to the open wind that came screaming down from Glacier National Park like it had a grievance. But it wasn't warm enough. It was never, no matter what she did, quite warm enough. She had burned through 4 cords of pine the previous January. 4. Stoking the firebox every 3 hours through the night, through the day, through every cold snap and every worse cold snap after it. Her arms had ached from carrying wood by February. Her hands had cracked along the knuckles. She had found herself calculating heat, the way a general calculates ammunition, always counting, always rationing, always aware of exactly how much she had left and exactly how fast she was burning through it. And still, 38 degrees at 3 in the morning, Milo curled in his coat, Ida in the next room, 81 pounds of woman and failing lungs, and a cough that came and went with the temperature changes, always worse at night, always worse in January, and Valdez had learned to gauge Ida's condition by the sound coming through the wall the way a doctor reads a pulse. Steady cough, manageable. Deep cough, get up. No cough at all, also get up. She sat there in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of it. This was not sustainable. She had known it since February. She had filed it away the way you file things you can't yet solve in the back of the mind behind the tasks that have immediate answers. Plant the garden, cut the hay, replace the north fence, order supplies before October, survive one thing at a time. But sitting on the edge of Milo's bed, 3 in the morning, 38 degrees, she let herself know it all the way down. Something had to change. Not next year, not when circumstances improved. Before December, before the real cold settled in, before January did to Ida's lungs what January always threatened to do. She pulled the blanket up over Milo's shoulder. He didn't stir, just breathed steadily, small chest rising and falling in the dark. She went back to the main room and sat at the table and did not sleep. By 4 in the morning, she had a plan. By 5, she had decided she was probably out of her mind. By 6, she had decided she didn't care. She went out at first light to look at the Quonset. It had been sitting in the yard since October 16. Sections of corrugated steel, curved like the ribs of something enormous, laid out in the frost-hardened grass where she had unloaded them from the truck. Surplus from the Army Depot in Great Falls, 20 feet wide, 48 feet long at full assembly, cost $75, which was either a bargain or the most expensive mistake she had ever made, depending on who you asked. The neighbors had opinions. The neighbors always had opinions, but that morning alone in the early light, with her breath making small clouds in the frozen air, Valdez walked the perimeter of the stacked panels and let herself think about what her father had told her. Bertram Kessler had not been a sentimental man. He had been precise, methodical, a builder of commercial cold storage facilities in Minnesota from 1912 through 1925, a man who understood insulation the way other men understood weather, as a practical problem with a physical solution, not a philosophical one. He had taken Valdez to job sites from the time she was 12, not to teach her a trade, because he needed someone to hold the measuring tape and write down numbers, and she was available, and she was careful, and she didn't complain about the cold. She had stood in the skeleton of a warehouse icehouse in Duluth in the winter of 1919, age 20, and watched her father build a gap. That was what he called it, the gap. An 18-inch space between two walls, the inner wall and the outer shell sealed at the top and bottom with only small ventilation openings, not insulated, just air, dead, still, unmoving air, no convection, no path for wind to move through, just a cushion of nothing between the cold outside and the product inside that needed to stay cold at a steady, controlled temperature. Air doesn't conduct heat, her father had told her, not looking up from the chalk line he was marking. Moving air strips it. That's the whole problem with cold. It's not the temperature, it's the movement. He looked up then. Stop the movement. You stop the loss. She had written the number down in her notebook. 18 inches. Gap. She had not thought about it in years. Until February of this year, sitting in that 38-degree room with Milo coughing through his coat, and the thought had arrived fully formed, the way thoughts do when you've been not thinking about something for a very long time. A gap. Not thicker walls, not more wood, a gap. Build the Quonset shell around the existing cabin. Leave a 2-foot space between the metal and the logs. Let the air sit still in that space. Stop the wind before it touched the logs. Stop the convection. Stop the heat from bleeding away into the Montana night, 3 degrees at a time, 4 cords of wood at a time, 1 cracked pair of knuckles at a time. Simple, obvious. Except no one in Flathead County had done it, and no one in Flathead County thought it would work, and she had spent the past 3 weeks finding this out, in the particular way you find out what a community thinks, not because they come to you and say it plainly, but because of the silences, the pauses, the careful way people had of looking at the half-assembled metal ribs in her yard before looking back at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. It wasn't neutral. She found the notebook in October, a week after she bought the Quonset sections. She wasn't looking for it. She was going through the box of Orland's things she had been meaning to go through for just over a year and had not yet gone through because going through it required a version of herself she hadn't quite assembled yet. The box sat in the corner of the bedroom like a piece of furniture she had decided to live around, a table she never used, a chair she never sat in. She opened it on a Saturday morning when Milo was at the Pearson place and Ida was asleep and the house was quiet enough that she had no excuse not to. Most of what was in the box was what she expected: work records, deed papers, the carbons of 2 letters Orland had written to his brother in Oregon that she hadn't known about, which she set aside and read twice and then carefully refolded. A small collection of items that made no sense individually, but made a kind of sense together. A fishing lure, a button from a coat, a photograph of 2 men she didn't recognize, standing in front of a truck that she did. The notebook was at the bottom. Orland had kept a winter log every year since 1941. Temperature readings morning and evening, cord count on the woodpile, notes on the firebox, the flue, the chimney, practical, methodical brief, the handwriting of a man who saw record-keeping as maintenance, not expression. She flipped through it, and recognized the rhythm of it. Their winters annotated. Then she reached a page near the middle. Not a temperature reading, not a cord count. A sketch, rough, fast, done in pencil with the pressure of someone thinking faster than their hand could follow. 2 concentric outlines, a small rectangle nested inside a larger curved shape. An arrow pointing to the space between them. 2 words underlined, once wind gap. That was all. No measurements, no notes, no explanation. Just the shape of the idea caught on paper, the way you catch something peripheral, not looking directly at it, but knowing it was there. He had been thinking about it. He hadn't finished the thought. He had started it, drawn the question, not the answer, and then gone on to the next page, which was a temperature reading from October 9th, 1946, the last entry before the accident, the last notation in the last notebook, in the box in the corner. She had been living around for just over a year. Valdez sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, with the notebook open on her knees. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had cried at the funeral, which felt appropriate, and she had cried once in February, in the woodshed where no one could hear her, which also felt appropriate. But this was different. This was not grief, or not only grief. This was recognition. He had seen the same problem she had seen. He had drawn the shape of the same solution she was now buying in sections from an Army surplus depot in Great Falls. They had never talked about it. They never got to. She closed the notebook and set it on the nightstand where it had remained for 3 weeks while she ordered steel panels and arranged transport, and tried not to think too hard about what it meant that she was completing a thought her husband had started and never finished. She didn't need it to mean anything. She just needed it to work. The first person to say something was Rupert Gala. Rupert was 58 years old and had been building cabins in Flathead County since Eisenhower was a general, which he mentioned frequently and not always in relevant contexts. He was a compact, deliberate man with large hands and the unhurried confidence of someone who had never been wrong about a structural problem, or at least had never been informed that he was wrong, which amounted to more or less the same thing after long enough. He came by on a Tuesday without calling, which was standard for Rupert, and walked a slow circuit around the stacked panels in the yard with his hands in his coat pockets and his face doing a careful thing that was not quite a frown. "What is this?" he said, not a question. "Quonset sections," Valdez said. "Army surplus." "I can see what they are." He stopped walking. "What are you doing with them?" She explained it, briefly. The shell around the cabin, the 2-foot air gap, the dead air as a convection barrier, wind hitting the steel before it hit the logs, the physics of it, the numbers. Rupert listened with the specific quality of attention that means someone is waiting for you to finish so they can explain why you're wrong. "Moisture," he said when she stopped. "Vented," she said. 4 6-inch vents at the base, 2 at the ridge. 6 holes aren't enough to fight the condensation from a whole cabin. That gap is going to be a sweat box by February. The moisture is going to sit on the outside of your log wall and work inward. You'll have rot in your sills before spring. The air in the gap will be drier than the interior air, less moisture in still cold air than in warm occupied space. "That's theory," Rupert said. "I'm talking about reality." She looked at him for a moment. "I know the difference," she said. He left 20 minutes later without resolving anything, which was also standard for Rupert. He left the way he always left difficult conversations, not storming off, not capitulating, just withdrawing with dignity, as if he had made his point and the consequences were no longer his responsibility. She watched him drive out of the yard and then went back to work. The second person was Pastor Hines. He came on a Thursday, which was significant because Thursday was not a day Pastor Hines typically visited anyone, and the specificity of the visit made its purpose clear before he said a word. He was a tall, thin man with excellent posture and the deliberate speech of someone who had spent 40 years being listened to and had come to expect it. He did not walk around the panels. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at them, and then looked at her with an expression that was probably intended to be pastoral concern and landed somewhere closer to bewilderment. "Valdis," he said, "this is a significant undertaking. It is. For a woman in your situation," she let that sit in the cold air between them for a moment. "My situation," she said, "alone, with responsibilities, a child and your mother-in-law." He paused. "Has anyone looked at the plans? Anyone with experience in this kind of work?" "I have experience in this kind of work." He smiled, the particular smile of a man who has decided to be patient. "I only mean that a project of this scale, structural decisions, the safety of the home, these are things where it might be worth getting another perspective, someone with technical training." "I appreciate the concern," Valdis said, in the voice she used when she did not appreciate something. He left. She stared at the door for a while after he left. Technical training. She thought about the Duluth ice house, the measuring tape, her father's chalk lines, the particular education of a woman who was never taught anything directly but learned everything anyway by standing close enough and paying attention. She picked up her tools and went back to work. The third was Dewey Cass. Dewey was the county agricultural extension agent, which meant his skepticism came with an institutional backing that the others lacked, and he was the one who gave her the most pause, because Dewey was not stupid and he was not competitive, and he had no apparent reason to want her to fail. He came in the second week of November with a clipboard and an expression of genuine concern and the slightly apologetic manner of a man who was about to tell you something you didn't want to hear. "I've been looking at what you're describing," he said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for but hadn't refused. "The principle is sound on paper. Dead air is a good insulator. No argument there." "But," Valdis said, "the snow load worries me." He tapped the clipboard. "That roof profile, the Quonset curve, it sheds some load, but if we get a wet snow with a crust, you're looking at significant weight on a structure that isn't designed to bear combined loading from the shell and the original cabin roof underneath. If the shell fails, it fails onto your cabin." She had thought about this. She had run the numbers. She walked him through them, the gauge of the steel, the rib spacing, the timber frame she was using to keep the shell independent of the cabin structure, the load path, the clearances. He listened. He took notes. He asked 3 specific questions, each of which she answered specifically, and she watched his expression change in the careful, reluctant way that expressions change when someone is being convinced against their preference. "This isn't in any manual I've seen," he said finally. "No," she agreed. He looked at his notes for a moment. "The ventilation gap. If the math works, and I'm not saying it does, but if it does, the temperature differential between the gap and the interior should prevent the condensation problem." "Yes. The problem is the math only works if the assumption about air movement is correct. If there's any convection in that gap, any at all, you lose most of the benefit. The baffles on the vents are designed to create laminar inflow, no turbulence in the gap." Dewey looked at her for a long moment, tapped his pen once on the clipboard. "If it doesn't work the way you're describing," he said, "the failure mode is going to be significant." "I know. And if it does work," he didn't finish the sentence, just looked at his notes again. She waited. "Keep records," he said finally. "Temperature, inside and outside, every 6 hours if you can manage it. If this works the way you think it does, the documentation is going to matter." She already had the notebook ready. The fourth came without a clipboard or a theological position or 2 decades of professional credibility. Phyllis Galley came with a covered dish and a directness that Valdis had always respected about her, even when it was inconvenient. Phyllis was Rupert's wife. This had always seemed like an improbable match to Valdis. Phyllis was quick where Rupert was deliberate, plain-spoken, where he was careful and possessed of a quality Rupert entirely lacked, which was the willingness to say the uncomfortable thing before anyone else in the room had worked up the nerve. She came on a Wednesday afternoon when Rupert was at a job site, which Valdis noted, time not accidental. She set the covered dish on the table and sat down and looked at Valdis with an expression that was not concern and was not judgment and was something closer to information being delivered. Rupert isn't the only one who doesn't want this to work, she said. Valdis poured the coffee. I know. He's got 3 contracts lined up for spring, new families coming into the valley, double wall construction, good money. Phyllis wrapped both hands around the cup. If you build this thing and it works, those families are going to hear about it, and they're going to ask him to build it, which he will once it's your idea that succeeded instead of his idea that failed. She paused. But right now in November, it's easier for him if it doesn't work. Valdis sat with this for a moment, not because it surprised her, because it was useful to hear it plainly rather than to know it in the imprecise way you know things that haven't been said. He's not a bad man, Phyllis said. He's a practical one. I know. Phyllis looked at her. Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, more like a door opening. Does it keep the heat? She asked. What you're building, is it actually going to keep the heat? Yes. How sure? Sure enough to stake the winter on it. Phyllis was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that was not advice and not approval, but was the thing Valdis had not realized she needed someone to say, then build it fast, before the ground freezes any harder. She left an hour later, and Valdis stood in the yard in the afternoon cold and felt for the first time in 3 weeks something she had not been able to locate. Steadiness, not certainty. Steadiness, which is different. Certainty says, I know this will work. Steadiness says, I'm going to do it anyway. She went back to the panels. The construction took 3 weeks, alone mostly. Milo helped on the weekends with the tasks she could trust to a 9-year-old, holding the measuring tape, handing up hardware, keeping track of the bolt count. He did these things with the seriousness of a child who understands without being told that the work matters. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He watched. She had learned from her father by watching. Maybe that was how it passed. The steel ribs went up first, mounted to a timber frame she had built on the extended fieldstone foundation 30 inches out from the original cabin perimeter, carrying the Quonset arch clear of the log walls. The panels bolted to the ribs with 4-inch overlaps, sealed with tar paper at the joints. The chimney penetrated both structures through a double collar steel at the Quonset clay tile, at the cabin roof mineral wool packed into the gap between them. The air gap was exactly 24 inches at its narrowest point. She measured it at 6 locations. She measured it twice. She cut the vents herself, 4 6-inch openings near the base, screened and baffled, to allow air exchange without allowing airflow. 2 ridge vents at the peak. The baffles were the part she spent the most time on, the part she recalculated 3 times, the part her father had described only in principle, which meant she had to work out the specific geometry herself, sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook and a pencil and the memory of standing in a Duluth ice house at 20 years old, watching cold air move and not move. She got it, not because she was certain, because she sat with the problem long enough. The airlock entry took 2 days, a small vestibule between the outer Quonset door and the original cabin door, 8 feet square, serving as a buffer zone for temperature and as an explanation every time someone stepped through it of exactly what she had built and why. The double flash collar on the chimney took half a day and a vocabulary of words she didn't use in front of Milo. The total cost came to $112, $75 for the Quonset sections, $22 for lumber, $10 for hardware, $5 for mineral wool and tar paper. 3 weeks of work. On the last day of assembly, she tightened the final bolt and climbed down off the roof and stood back and looked at what she had built. It looked like a barn had eaten her house. There was no other way to describe it. The graceful arch of the Quonset shell rising over the cabin's steep pitched roof, swallowing it her house inside a larger shape like something sheltering inside something else. The dim corridor of the air gap visible at the south end where she hadn't yet closed the vestibule wall, the chimney rising through both roof lines with its double collar like a seam in something. Milo came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a moment, looking up at it. "It looks like a turtle," he said. She considered this. "Good," she said. "Turtles are warm." He thought about this with the seriousness of a 9-year-old processing information that might be important. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went inside. Valdez stayed outside a moment longer. It was the 3rd of November, 1947. The temperature was dropping, not the dangerous kind of dropping, not yet, just the ordinary dropping of an early Montana evening, the light going amber and thin, and the air going sharp. She could feel the cold on her face, and she thought about her father and his chalk lines and his careful voice explaining what moving air does to heat. She thought about Orland's notebook in the bedroom, 2 words underlined, once wind gap. She thought about Milo's coat and Ida's lungs and the 4 cords of pine she had burned through last January, trying to heat a space that bled heat from every surface simultaneously. She looked at the shell she had built, 24 inches of air, curved steel, dead still space between the cold and the warmth. Not a thicker wall, not a bigger fire, a gap. She went inside. The Quonset came over the cabin like cupped hands, like something deliberate, like something that had decided against reasonable expectation to stay. And December was coming. December came like a verdict, not a gradual thing, not a slow cooling, not the polite retreat of autumn giving way to something harder. It came the way verdicts come all at once, with the full weight of something that had already been decided somewhere else by something that did not consult you first. December 8th. The thermometer outside the Quonset shell read -18 Fahrenheit at 6 in the morning. Valdez read it and went inside and made coffee. She had her notebook open on the table. She wrote the number down. Outside -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside 61 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire had been banked since midnight. She had not added wood since 10 the previous evening. She wrote that down too. 79 degrees of difference, from the air outside to the air in the room where she was sitting, with a fire she hadn't touched in 8 hours. She drank her coffee and looked at the number for a while. Then she got up and made breakfast. Because this was the thing no one tells you about being right. It doesn't feel triumphant. It doesn't feel like vindication or relief or any of the clean, satisfying emotions you imagine in advance. It feels like work. It feels like now I have to document this properly. Now I have to make sure the vents aren't blocked by drifting. Now I have to check the collar on the chimney because the temperature differential this morning is going to create condensation at the joint points, and I need to know if the mineral wool is holding. Triumph is for people who have someone to be triumphant with. Valdez had a notebook and a pencil, and a boy who needed breakfast, and a mother-in-law who needed her medication at 7:30, and a woodpile that was for the first time in her adult life in this house not a source of daily anxiety. She woke Milo at 7. He came into the kitchen in his socks. No coat. He had not, she noticed, put the coat on. He had just walked down the hall in his socks like a child who had not yet remembered that walking down the hall in socks was something you brace for. She watched him not brace. He sat down at the table and reached for the bread and said nothing, just ate, comfortable, like a child who did not know in that moment that he was doing something that should have been impossible. She looked at him for longer than she should have. Then she wrote down the time, 7:04 a.m., interior temperature 62 degrees Fahrenheit, child present, no coat. This was the data she was collecting, not just degrees, not just wood consumption, the actual lived, daily reality of what it meant when the number changed. Outside, the valley was doing what it did. December 8th was just the beginning. The high-pressure system that had stalled over Alberta had no intention of moving. By the 12th, the overnight low was -31. By the 18th, -38, with a wind that came down from the northwest at 40 miles per hour and turned the cold into something physical, something with weight and intention, something that didn't blow so much as press. People in the valley started burning through their reserves. This was the thing about cold that people who haven't experienced it at this scale tend to underestimate. It's not a single problem. It's a cascade. You burn more wood, which means you need more runs to the wood pile, which means more exposure, which means more cold brought in on your clothes and your body, which means the interior temperature drops a degree every time the door opens, which means you burn more wood. The firebox runs hot, and the chimney builds creosote faster than normal, and the draft changes, and the smoke backs up, and the family wakes at 2 in the morning, coughing for different reasons than they should be coughing at 2 in the morning. The Holt family, 3 miles north, burned through their November reserve by December 14th. The Pearson place ran out of the dry season wood first and switched to green-cut pine that smoked and hissed and gave 60% of the heat for twice the effort. The Colfax operation, which was the biggest spread in the immediate area and always had more resources than anyone else, was burning nearly a cord every 5 days. Rupert Gila, who had a workshop separate from the house and needed it heated, ran out of the good stock entirely and drove to the depot for emergency corewood on December 16th. Coming home on the frozen road, the truck hit ice and he overcorrected, and the overcorrection sent him sideways into the ditch at the corner of the county road. The truck was fine, his right hand was not. He had grabbed the door frame instinctively, and the impact had folded his wrist in a direction wrists don't go. He drove himself to the doctor in town with one hand. The fracture was clean. The cast would be on for 6 weeks. The 6 families who had been expecting Rupert's crew for construction work in January were now waiting. Valdez heard about it from Milo, who heard about it from the Pearson boy, who heard about it at the feed store. She did not say anything about it. She went out the next morning and cut a cord of wood from the back quarter she had laid up in October and loaded it onto the sled and left it at the Gailey property road gate with no note. Just the wood. He would know where it came from. She did not wait to see if he acknowledged it. There are things you do because they're right, not because they'll be recognized, not because recognition is coming, just because the alternative is leaving a man with a broken wrist and a family that is cold, and that is not a thing you let happen to your neighbor, regardless of what your neighbor has said about your Quonset shell. This is what Valdez understood about community, that some people spend their whole lives not learning it is not transactional. It cannot be. The moment you start keeping score is the moment you stop being a community and start being a ledger. She went home and cooked dinner and wrote her temperature numbers in the notebook. December 20th, minus 38 Fahrenheit, outside. The wind had been running at 35 miles per hour for 9 hours. In the Flathead Valley on that morning, most families with functional fireplaces were achieving an indoor temperature of somewhere between 38 and 44 degrees. This was not a comfortable temperature. This was a survival temperature. This was the temperature at which you wore your coat inside and you moved as little as possible, and you rationed the wood by counting pieces, and you told the children that it was almost over, even when you weren't sure it was. The Holt children were sleeping in the main room, all three of them, because the main room had the only functioning heat source, and the bedrooms had dropped below freezing overnight. Mrs. Holt, who was 29 years old and had grown up in Iowa, had never experienced cold like this. She told her husband that if they survived January, she was going home to her mother. He didn't argue. At the Pearson place, Guillaume Pelka, a trapper and part-time hand who lived in the bunkhouse on the Pearson property, woke up at 4 in the morning to find the small iron stove in his room had gone out, and the water in the tin cup on his nightstand had a skin of ice on it. He pulled on everything he owned and lay back down and waited for daylight. When daylight came, he went out to check his trap line. The trap line ran east along the creek bed and then turned north past the back corner of the Morrow property. He walked it the way he walked it every morning, methodical, unhurried, reading the landscape as information. And he stopped, because coming from the Morrow chimney, the inner chimney, the one rising through the curved Quonset shell, was a thread of smoke, thin, pale, the kind of smoke that comes from a banked fire, a contained fire, a fire that is not working particularly hard. He stood on the creek bank and looked at it for a long moment. In the valley around him, the other chimneys were pumping. Thick, dark, constant columns of smoke, the visual signature of a firebox, running at maximum effort, consuming wood as fast as it could be fed, trying to compensate for heat leaving in every direction faster than it could be generated. That was what full effort looked like in this cold. The Morrow chimney looked like October. He didn't stop that day. He filed it, the way you file things that don't make immediate sense in the back of your mind to be returned to. He mentioned it to nobody, but he took a slightly different route the next morning and the morning after that, and each morning the thread of smoke from the Morrow chimney was the same thin, steady, unhurried. On the morning of December 22nd, he stood on the creek bank for 5 full minutes looking at it, and then he walked around the long way to the trading post to pick up his mail. He mentioned it to 2 people at the trading post, not as gossip, not as information exactly, but as a question wearing the clothes of an observation. Have you noticed the Morrow chimney? By December 23rd, 6 people in the valley were noticing the Morrow chimney. On the morning of December 23rd, Rupert Gala drove his truck slowly down the county road with his right hand in a cast and his left hand on the wheel, and his eyes going without his permission to the thin, pale thread of smoke rising from the Quonset shell at the end of the Morrow track. He sat in the truck at the junction for a moment. He was a practical man, not a sentimental one, not given to impulse or to gestures that could be misread. He had opinions, and he held them with the particular stubbornness of a man who had built enough things to know the difference between a good idea and a bad one. But he had a broken wrist and a family that was cold, and the Morrow chimney looked like October. He turned down the Morrow track. Valdez heard the truck. She looked out the window and saw who it was, and stood still in the kitchen for approximately 4 seconds, making a decision about what expression to have on her face. When she opened the door, she went with nothing, just open. She opened the door. Rupert Galley stood on her step with his right hand in a cast and his coat collar up and his hat pulled low, and the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had told himself he wasn't going. "Valdez," he said. "Rupert." A pause. The cold came in around him. "Everything all right out here?" he said. She stepped back from the door without answering, which was an answer. He came in and stopped. She watched him stop. She had been watching people stop in her doorway for 3 weeks now. Dewey Cass making his official rounds, the Pearson boy delivering a message, Milo's schoolteacher dropping off work, a succession of people who came in expecting to step from outside cold to inside cold that was slightly less cold, and she had cataloged the precise moment when each of them understood that something was different. It was never the thermometer. Nobody looked at the thermometer first. It was the body, the skin, the immediate involuntary recalibration of the nervous system when it encountered warmth that was more than it expected, the slight opening of the shoulders, the unconscious release of the held tension that you carry in cold weather without knowing you're carrying it, the breath that doesn't cloud. That was the moment, every time. Rupert stood in her kitchen doorway and recalibrated. He was quiet for long enough that it was meaningful. Milo was at the table doing schoolwork, wearing a light flannel shirt and wool socks. Not a coat, not a sweater, just the shirt. His elbows were on the table. He was leaning forward over his notebook in the easy posture of a child who was not cold. Rupert looked at him, at the table, at the shirt, at the ease of it. He looked at the thermometer on the wall, 63 degrees. He walked to the thermometer, slowly, stood in front of it. Outside, the wind was audible against the Quonset shell, a low, continuous pressure, the sound of something that wanted to get in and couldn't find the way. The shell absorbed it, deflected it. The logs inside never felt it. "What's outside?" Rupert said. -35, Valdez said. "As of 6 this morning." He did the arithmetic without being asked. She could see him doing it. His eyes moved the way eyes move when the mind is running numbers that are coming out wrong. 98 degrees of difference. He put out his left hand, the unbroken one, and pressed it flat against the log wall, felt what she already knew, cool to the touch. Not cold, not radiating cold, just cool the way a wall feels when it is simply the boundary between inside and outside, not a surface hemorrhaging warmth in both directions simultaneously. "How much wood?" he said. 3/4 of a cord since the 1st of December. The silence that followed this was the loudest silence she had heard in months. A cord every 4 days. That was what his neighbors were burning. 3/4 of a cord in 3 weeks. "That's," he started. "I know," she said. He turned and looked at the room again, at Milo, at the ease, at the thermometer, at all of it arranged in front of him like evidence. He was quiet for a moment that went on longer than most moments. "I've built 32 cabins in this valley," he said, not defensively, not the way someone says something to win an argument, just as a fact, as context, as a man measuring himself against something. 32 cabins, 20 years, and I never—" He stopped. "You never thought of it," Valdez said, gently, without point scoring. "No," he said. Another silence. "I've been building cabins," he said slowly, "and you've been building something else." She poured him coffee, because it was something to do that didn't require either of them to say anything. He sat down. He sat at her kitchen table in his cast and his coat with his coffee, and for a few minutes they didn't talk, and Milo worked on his arithmetic, and outside the wind moved over the Quonset shell and found no purchase and moved on, and inside it was 63 degrees Fahrenheit, and Rupert Gell sat in that warmth and felt probably a great many things that he was not the kind of man to say. She didn't need him to say them. He knew that was enough. December 25th. Milo asked for nothing for Christmas except if they could keep the fire lower because he was actually too hot at night, which was the best thing anyone had said to Valdez in just over a year. She gave him extra blankets anyway because he was 9 and deserved extra blankets, and also because she needed something to do with the specific, overwhelming relief she felt when he said it. "Keep the fire lower because I'm too hot." She went out to the woodpile to take stock and stood in the cold for a while. The woodpile was almost exactly where she'd expected it to be. 3/4 of a cord used in December. At this rate, even with January coming, even with the worst of it still ahead, she would not run out. She had budgeted for 2.5 cords for the winter, and she was going to finish with at least a cord in reserve. A cord in reserve. She had not had a cord in reserve in 6 years. She stood in the cold for a while longer, not because she needed to, just because sometimes you need to stand in a thing and feel it. Feel the cold without it meaning danger. Feel the winter without it meaning crisis. Feel the gap between yourself and disaster, and understand that the gap is yours, that you built it, that it is going to hold. Word moved through the valley, the way word moves in small communities, not through any formal channel, not through any announcement, just through the accumulation of observations that people couldn't leave alone. Guillaume Pelke mentioned the chimney to 2 people. Those 2 people drove past the Morrow place and looked. What they saw was a Quonset shell and a thin thread of smoke, and a yard that was not panicked. No extra truck making emergency runs to the woodlot. No family huddled at the window. Just a farmhouse inside a steel shell looking like something strange, doing something extraordinary. By December 28th, Dewey Cass had heard enough second-hand reports that he could not professionally ignore them. He came on the morning of January 2nd, 1948, not casually, with purpose. He had his official calibrated thermometer, the one used for the county weather station, the instrument whose accuracy was not a matter of opinion, and he had his clipboard and his professional expression and the particular manner of a man who was arriving to disprove something and had left himself the intellectual space to be wrong. He stood in the airlock vestibule for a moment. The vestibule was 8 degrees warmer than outside. He noted it without comment. Then he opened the inner door. He stood in the kitchen for 20 minutes. He walked to every corner of the room. He held the thermometer at chest height, the way you hold it when you want a true air temperature reading and not a reading influenced by proximity to the heat source. He went to the north wall, the corner farthest from the firebox, and held the thermometer there for 3 full minutes, 58 degrees, in the coldest corner of the room, with the fire banked. He came back to the center of the room and stood there for a while longer, looking at the thermometer. Outside, according to his own instrument, it was minus 35 Fahrenheit, a difference of 93 degrees, corner to outside, average room temperature 63, difference from outside 98 degrees. He wrote all of this down very carefully with the handwriting of a man who was ensuring that the record was accurate because the record was going to matter. Then he looked up at Valdis. "I told you this wouldn't work," he said. "You did," she said. "I was wrong." He said it simply. First, not buried at the end of a qualification, not preceded by a long list of caveats, not softened or redirected. First, "I was wrong, completely wrong." He looked at his notebook. At roughly 1/5 of the fuel consumption of a standard cabin in this valley, you're maintaining a temperature more than 20 degrees warmer than the area average in one of the most severe cold events in Flathead County history. He tapped the page once. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a different category of result. Valdis said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would add to it, because he had said the true thing and it was hanging in the warm air of the kitchen, and it didn't need her to annotate it. "I'm going to write this up for the state extension office," Dewey said. "With your permission, I want to get the documentation in order while the conditions are still extreme enough to make the comparison meaningful." "Write it up," she said. "I'll need your records, the temperature logs." She put the notebook on the table in front of him. Every 6 hours since November 3rd, inside temperature, outside temperature, wood consumption, weather conditions, 61 days of data entered in the precise, unhurried handwriting of a woman who had learned to document things from a father who understood that the record was the argument. Dewey looked at it for a long moment. "You've been keeping this since the day you finished construction," he said. "Yes, in case you needed to prove it." She thought about that. "In case the data was useful," she said, "for whoever came next." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the notebook carefully, the way you pick up something you understand is going to be cited. She had made 3 copies, one for him, one for the county records, one for herself in the box in the corner of the bedroom next to Orland's winter log, next to the sketch with 2 words underlined, wind gap. The comparison data came together the following week when Dewey had gathered enough information from the surrounding properties to make the numbers real. The Colfax placed 2.1 cords in December, average interior temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit, firebox running continuously, family sleeping in the main room because the bedrooms were uninhabitable. The Rupert Gale property, 1.8 cords, average 48 degrees, one of the better built cabins in the valley, best conventional construction available. The Morrow property, 3/4 of a cord, average 63 degrees, built by one woman with borrowed tools and a notebook and a memory of her father explaining dead air in a Duluth icehouse 28 years ago. The difference between Rupert Gale's best conventional work and Valdis Morrow's shell 15 degrees and more than a cord of wood per month. The difference between the valley average and the Morrow property, 21 degrees warmer, 62% less fuel. These numbers were not subtle. They were not open to interpretation. They were not the kind of numbers you could explain away with variables or attribution errors or the suggestion that maybe her firebox was running unusually hot, or maybe her cabin happened to be in a sheltered spot, or maybe the thermometer needed calibrating. Dewey had calibrated the thermometer himself. He was wrong, and the documentation was precise, and both of those things were now part of the county record. On the morning of January 10th, Rupert Gale drove back down the Morrow track. No pretense this time. No asking if everything was all right. He knocked, she opened. He came in with a younger man she didn't recognize. early 30s, the specific look of someone who builds things for a living and is currently very interested in the floor plan. "This is my foreman," Rupert said. "I told him he should see it." She showed them the air gap corridor. She walked them through the south end, where the vestibule opened into the exterior passage between the shell and the logs. The space was dim, smelled of spruce and cold stone, not warm. The gap wasn't heated, but notably measurably warmer than outside. Dead air doing what dead air does. The foreman pressed his palm flat against the log wall, left it there a few seconds, looked at Rupert with an expression that said he didn't need to say anything. Rupert said nothing back. She explained the venting, the baffle design, the rib spacing, the independence of the shell structure from the cabin frame, the double collar on the chimney, the math she had run on the snow load. She explained it the way her father had explained things to her, not performing expertise, just describing how it worked, because how it worked was the interesting part. The foreman took notes. Rupert watched. His cast caught the thin winter light from the gap between the panels. At the end of the walkthrough, the foreman looked at her and said, "Could you do this on a new build, on a cabin we're constructing from the ground up?" She thought about it. "You'd get a cleaner gap," she said. "Better control over the spacing, more flexibility in the shell profile." She paused. "Yes." The foreman looked at Rupert. Rupert looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Valdis. "I have 3 contracts for spring," he said. "New families. They came asking for what I build." He paused. "What I build is going to change." It was not an apology. She did not need an apology. It was something more practical, an acknowledgement that the problem had a better solution than the one he'd been using, and that the better solution had come from a direction he hadn't expected, and that the appropriate response to this as a man who built things for people who depended on them to work was to use the better solution. "I'd want to see the first build," she said, "to check the baffle design. It's specific." "I know," he said. "I'll send word when we start." He left with his foreman. She heard the truck go down the track. She stood in the kitchen for a while, not triumphant, not vindicated, just present. In this warm room, in this cold winter, with her notebook on the table and Milo's schoolwork spread out and Ida's tea cooling on the counter and 63 degrees of interior temperature and a woodpile that was not a source of daily terror. She thought I didn't build this to prove something. She thought I built this so we wouldn't be cold. She thought it worked. And then she picked up her pencil and wrote the date, January 10th, 1948, inside 63, outside -22, wood used since December 1st, 78% of 1 cord, and then she closed the notebook and stood in her warm kitchen and let the winter be exactly what it was, outside pressing against the steel, moving over the curved surface, finding no grip, no entry, no way through. Just cold moving around something that refused to yield to it. Just wind and a shell and 24 inches of dead air standing between the worst Montana could send and the people she had built it to protect. Outside, the cold was still there. It would be there until March. But it was outside, and she was not. January broke in stages, not all at once, not cleanly. The cold didn't apologize for what it had done to the valley. It just gradually, grudgingly retreated back toward whatever place cold goes when it's finished. By the 3rd week of January, the overnight lows were only -12. By the last week, only -4, which felt, after what the valley had been through, almost gentle, almost kind. People came out of their houses blinking, taking stock, counting what the winter had cost them, The accounting was not small. The Holt family had burned through their entire winter reserve by January 18th and had spent the final 2 weeks rationing green-cut pine that gave smoke before heat and heat that was never quite enough. Mrs. Holt had kept her youngest, a boy, just past 2 years old, bundled in everything the family owned and held against her body for warmth during the coldest nights. He had made it through without serious illness, barely by the specific grace of a mother's body heat, doing what architecture had failed to do. The Pearson bunkhouse where Guillaume Pelquet lived had dropped to 28 degrees on the night of December 18th, and Guillaume had slept in his boots and his coat and 3 pairs of socks, and still woken up with the water frozen in the cup on his nightstand and a view of his own breath against the ceiling. 2 families in the north part of the valley had needed emergency assistance, wood delivered by neighbors. Children temporarily relocated to warmer households. The specific logistics of a community in crisis managed quietly, without announcement, the way communities manage crises when they've been doing it long enough to know that the help matters more than the recognition of helping. And Rupert Gale had spent 6 weeks of one of the most severe winters in Flathead County memory, with a broken wrist and a wood supply that had nearly given out, sustained in part by a cord of unsolicited firewood left at his gate road, with no note by the woman whose Quonset shell he had told her would fail. This was the inventory January revealed, and then people started doing math, not deliberately, not sitting down with pencils and ledgers and intent, just the ordinary arithmetic of neighbors comparing notes at the trading post, at the feed store, at the church door after Sunday service. How much did you burn? What did you average inside? How many times did you get up at 2 a.m. to stoke the box? And somewhere in that arithmetic, the Morrow numbers kept appearing. 3/4 of a cord for December, less than a cord projected for January. Average interior temperature, 63 degrees. A child not wearing a coat indoors. An old woman with failing lungs who had made it through the coldest stretch in a generation without a single crisis night. The numbers did not fit the category of normal. They fit a different category entirely, and people being people needed to see it for themselves. They came in 2s and 3s through January, not formally, not with appointments. They came a little sideways, a little tentative, using practical pretexts, dropping off something borrowed, asking after Ida, stopping by because they were passing anyway, which they weren't, which everyone knew they weren't, but the pretense was comfortable, and Valdis allowed it because she understood what they were actually there for. She had been here before, in a Duluth ice house, on the receiving end of something that sounded impossible until you were standing in the space that proved it. So she let them in, and she watched their faces do what faces do when a body understands something the mind hasn't caught up with yet. The shoulders dropping, the breath releasing, the involuntary physical understanding of warmth that was different from what they expected. Not the warmth of a firebox, localized, directional, hot is close and cold is far. This was ambient, even, the warmth of a space that was holding temperature the way good ground holds water, slow and complete. She walked them through the gap corridor, showed them the venting, explained the dead air in the plain language her father had always used. Moving airstrips, heat still air holds. It stopped the movement and you stopped the loss. She explained it once clearly and then let the space do the rest of the work. They wrote things down. Some brought notebooks, 2 brought measuring tapes, which she found endearing. 24 inches. She measured it again in front of them. 24. That was all it was. 2 feet of still air between the worst cold in living memory and 63 degrees and a child doing schoolwork without a coat. The scale of it. 2 feet. By the end of January 6, families had asked specific questions about sourcing Quonset surplus from the Great Falls Depot. 3 had asked Rupert Gala about labor costs. 1 had gone directly to the depot without asking anyone. Rupert, for his part, had done something she had not expected. He had called a meeting, not a formal meeting, not announced anywhere, just a gathering at the Gala property on the first Saturday in February. 8 men who built things in Flathead County, sitting in Rupert's workshop with their coats on, because Rupert's workshop was not, it had to be said, a Quonset shell. Coffee and straight talk about how the design worked and what it would take to adapt it for new construction versus retrofit versus the specific challenges of certain site orientations. She found out about it from Phyllis. "He invited you," Phyllis said on the phone. "He told me to tell you. He couldn't make himself call." There it was, which was either charming or infuriating depending on how much grace you had available, and Valdis decided consciously with effort to find it charming. She went. She was the only woman in the workshop. She was also the only person in the room who had actually built one. These 2 facts arranged themselves in the air with the specific awkwardness of facts that everyone is aware of and no one is going to mention directly. She mentioned them directly. "I understand most of you have reservations about the design," she said, standing at the workbench with her hand on the plans she'd spread out. "I had reservations about the design. The condensation question is legitimate. The snow load question is legitimate. The ventilation baffle math is the part that's specific and has to be gotten right." She looked around the room. "Ask me the specific questions. I'll answer them." They asked, she answered, for 2 hours. Specific, technical, unhesitating. Not performing confidence, actually having it. The confidence of someone who has run the numbers and then checked the numbers and then lived in the results through an entire Montana winter. At the end of the 2 hours, Rupert rolled up the plans and held them. He looked at her. "I'm building the Osgood cabin in March," he said. "New construction. They want a double shell from the ground up." He paused. "I want you to sign off on the baffle design before we start framing." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll be there," she said. She went home and cooked dinner and did not make a thing of it. But she sat at the table after Mila was in bed and Ida was asleep and the house was quiet, and she thought about what had happened in that workshop. 8 men, 2 hours, her plans on the workbench, and nobody, not once, had suggested she needed someone else to verify her numbers. That was new. That was actually new. It was Phyllis who said the thing that needed saying. She came in the second week of February, mid-morning on a Tuesday when Rupert was at a job and Milo was at school and the house was just Valdis and Ida and the particular quiet of a winter morning that was for the first time in memory not a crisis. She came with a dish. She always came with a dish which Valdis had come to understand was Phyllis's way of having a reason to sit down and stay a while without having to announce that she was coming to sit down and stay a while. They sat at the kitchen table. For a while they talked about nothing specific. Ida's lungs, which were better, the Osgood contract, which was starting, the depot in Great Falls, which had apparently had a run on Quonset sections in January and was now placing orders for more. And then Phyllis set down her cup. "Rupert is going to make good money this spring," she said. "Better than any spring we've had." "I know, because of what you built, because he's building it well," Valdis said. That matters too. Phyllis looked at her with the directness of a woman who had not driven out here to be deflected. He didn't ask you, Phyllis said. He didn't ask your permission. He didn't offer you anything for the design. No. Does that bother you? Valdis thought about this honestly. Yes, she said, and no. Phyllis waited. The design moving through the valley is what I wanted, Valdis said. People being warm is what I wanted. Whether Rupert charges for the labor or I charge for the labor, the result is the same. She looked at her coffee. But yes, it bothers me. In the particular way it bothers you when someone takes a thing you made and puts their name on it. Or no name at all, Phyllis said. Or no name at all. Phyllis was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to do something about that. Phyllis, not just for you, for the record, she said it precisely, directly, not sentimental. The record should say who built this, who figured it out, who ran the numbers and filled the notebook and stood in the cold and made it work. Valdis looked at her. Phyllis Gila, who had come in November with a covered dish and a warning, who had sat at this table and told her quietly, without editorializing, that the opposition to her project had an economic motive, who had said, build it fast, before the ground freezes harder, who had chosen early and privately to be on the right side of this. What do you want to do? Valdis said. I want to go see Dewey Cass, Phyllis said. I want his report to say your name. I want it to say what you built and when you built it and what it does. I want there to be a document that exists that says Valdis Morrow, Flathead County, 1947, not a local homesteader, not an innovative approach, your name. Valdis was quiet for a moment. She thought about the box in the corner of the bedroom, about the notebook, about 61 days of temperature logs that were already in Dewey's hands. She thought about the thing she had already decided to do, the letter. I was going to write to the extension office myself, she said. Good, Phyllis said. Then we'll both go. They went on a Thursday. Dewey Cass's office was a single room above the county agricultural supply building, reached by an exterior staircase that was in February approximately as safe as any other exterior staircase, coated in a 1/4 inch of ice. They made it up without incident, which felt like a metaphor Valdis decided not to pursue. Dewey was at his desk. He looked up and saw the two of them, and his expression did the specific thing that careful professional men's expressions do when they understand they are about to be asked to take a position. He poured coffee without being asked. Valdis set her letter on his desk, handwritten 2 pages in the careful handwriting she had learned from a father who understood that the document was the argument. The letter proposed that the Extension Office publish a technical guide to the double shell design, free of charge, available to any homesteader who requested it. The letter included the baffle specifications, the vent calculations, the gap measurements, the chimney clearance requirements, and 60 days of comparative temperature data. And, at the top of the first page, as the source of the design, Valdis Morrow, Flathead County, November 1947. Dewey read it, slowly, carefully, with the attention of a man who was reading something official, because that was what it was. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. You're not asking for payment, he said. No, you're not asking for anything except attribution. I'm asking for the knowledge to be free, she said. Attribution is just accuracy. He looked at the letter again. The state office will publish whatever I submit, he said. With the documentation you've provided, the case is solid. They'll have no reason not to. Then submit it, Phyllis said. Dewey looked at her, then back at Valdez, then at the letter. He picked up his pen. He wrote at the top of his file copy in his own hand in the deliberate script of an official document attributed to Valdez Morrow, Flathead County, Montana. Single shell modification completed November 1947. Temperature data collected December 1947 through January 1948 under severe cold conditions. Design validated by County Agricultural Extension Measurement, January 2nd, 1948. He signed it. He looked up. I was wrong in October, he said. I told you it wouldn't work. I was thorough in my reasoning and completely wrong in my conclusion. You were, she said. I'd like it noted for whatever it's worth that I said so at the time, to you directly. You did, she said. That matters. He nodded once. Then he filed the letter and poured more coffee, and they talked for an hour about the baffle specifications and the spring construction schedule and whether the Great Falls Depot was likely to have sufficient Quonset inventory to meet the anticipated demand, and by the time they left, Valdez Morrow's name was in the county record attached to the design, permanent and specific and not going anywhere. Her name on the thing she built, not because someone gave it to her, because she had written a letter and climbed an icy staircase and put the document on the desk of the man who had the authority to make it official, because she had done the work, and the work deserved a name, and because Phyllis Gala had sat at her kitchen table in February and said the record should say who built this, which is to say, some women arrive in your life at exactly the moment you most need someone to say the obvious thing plainly, and when they do, the right response is to go up the icy stairs with them and let it be official. The technical guide was published by the Montana State Extension Office in March 1948. 4 pages, plain language, drawings rendered from her specifications, distributed by mail to every county agricultural extension in the state and upon request to homesteaders directly, free of charge. On the cover page, in the attribution line, it read, Design developed by Valdez Morrow, Flathead County, based on dead air insulation principles applied in commercial cold storage construction. Not the Morrow method, not the Morrow shell, just the attribution, clean and accurate and permanently in the public record. By spring, the requests had started coming in from outside Montana, Idaho first, then western Wyoming. Then by May, a letter from a homesteader in Alaska who had heard about the guide through the Agricultural Journal Network and wanted the full specifications, including the chimney clearance requirements and the baffle angle. She answered every letter herself, every single one. In the evenings after dinner at the kitchen table, with the good lamp pulled close and Milo asleep down the hall and Ida in her chair by the window, she wrote the specifications out by hand on plain paper, drew the diagrams herself, the cross-sections and the detailed drawings, the particular angle of the baffle that she had worked out at the same table in October, with a pencil and the memory of standing in a Duluth ice house at 20 years old. She signed every letter, V. Morrow, Flathead County, Montana, not because she needed credit, because she understood in the way her father had always understood that knowledge passed forward is the only kind that survives. The kind you keep dies with you. The kind you give away keeps going. Give it away. Put your name on it so people know where to send the questions. Answer the questions. Give that away too. That was the whole of it. She found the invoice in March. She had gone back into the Box Orleans box, the one she had opened in October and had been returning to gradually in pieces as she became able to look for the property tax documentation she needed for the spring filing. The invoice was tucked behind the tax folder on depot letterhead from the Great Falls Army Surplus Depot, dated March 14, 1946, 6 months before Orlean died. It was an inquiry invoice, the kind depots issued when someone called to ask about availability and pricing before committing to a purchase. Quonset hut sections 20-foot width, standard military surplus, quantity 1 unit, price quoted $75. He had called and asked. He had not bought, not yet. He had asked the price, gotten the quote, and then the next steps had not happened because September had happened instead, and the accident at the mill, and then just over a year of a box in the corner of the bedroom that she couldn't open yet. But he had called. He had held the question in his hands and called the depot and written down the price, $75. He had known the number. He had been deciding. She sat on the edge of the bed with the invoice for a long time, not crying, just sitting with the precision of it, the exact, careful precision of how close things come to each other across the distance of time. He had been months away from buying the sections. She had been months away from having a husband to build this with instead of building it alone. And yet, she thought he knew. Not the solution. He didn't have the solution. He had the shape of the question when gap, 2 words underlined, and he had the price of the materials and an inquiry dated 6 months before he died. He had been circling it. The way you circle a thing you know is important before you're ready to go straight at it, and she had gone straight at it, without him, which was the hardest version of the task and the only version available. She folded the invoice and put it in the notebook, between the pages of December data, the cold numbers and the warm numbers, and the record of every 6 hours of a winter that had been his question, finished in her handwriting. That was where it belonged. Spring came slowly, the way spring comes in Montana, not announced, not sudden, just a gradual accumulation of small evidence. The light changing, the creek loosening, the mud coming back, the specific smell of frozen ground releasing that is not quite like any other smell on earth. Valdez walked the property in March, with Milo checking fences, taking stock of what the winter had required and what it had left intact. The Quonset shell had shed its snow load cleanly throughout the curved profile, doing what she'd calculated it would do shedding, instead of accumulating the steel emerging from February, looking exactly as it had gone in, solid, uncompromised, exactly as designed. Milo ran his hand along the lower panels where the steel met the foundation extension. He was 9 years old, and he had spent the winter watching her check the vents and read the thermometer and write numbers in the notebook with the regularity of someone performing a ritual that had a point to it. "Did it work the way you thought?" he asked. She considered the question. "Better than I thought in some ways," she said. "Exactly as I thought in others." He thought about this. Which part's better? The thermal retention overnight. I thought we'd lose more heat with the fire banked. We didn't lose nearly as much as I calculated. She stopped at the south end and checked the lower vents. Clear, dry, no frost damage. The dead air held better than I modeled. He nodded with the seriousness of a 9-year-old who was filing this information somewhere he would return to. "What's dead air?" he said. She crouched down and pointed at the vent opening. "Air that isn't moving. Moving air takes heat away. Air that's sitting still, completely still, holds it, like a blanket except invisible." She stood up. The gap in there is full of air that isn't going anywhere. It just sits, and because it's sitting, the cold outside can't get to the logs. And because the cold can't get to the logs, the heat inside can't escape. He looked at the gap opening, considering. So it's nothing, he said. The thing that keeps us warm is nothing. She looked at him. That's the most accurate thing anyone has said about it, she said. He seemed satisfied with this. He went ahead down the fence line and she followed, and the spring mud pulled at their boots, and overhead the sky was doing what Montana skies do in March, vast and layered and full of a light that was genuinely warmer than it had been 3 months ago, the kind of light that means something in this latitude. The warmth you feel in March in Montana is not abstract. You earn it. It means something specific because the cold it followed was specific. Because you know in your body, in your cracked knuckles, in your sleep-interrupted memory, exactly what that cold cost and what it took to make it through. By summer, there were 19 structures in Flathead County built or retrofitted on the dead air gap principle. Not all of them were Quonset shells. The design had already begun to adapt to available materials. 3 used pole barn construction. 2 used extended roof systems that enclosed specific wall sections. One homesteader built an outer wall of stacked cordwood 18 inches deep that served as thermal mass and wind barrier simultaneously. Valdez went to see the cordwood wall. She stood in front of it for a while. The principle is the same, the woman said. She was in her 30s, lean and direct, with the hands of someone who worked outside. Stop the wind. Give the air somewhere to sit still. It doesn't have to be steel. No, Valdez agreed. It doesn't. I read your guide, the woman said. The extension office guide. It says your name. It does. Good, the woman said simply. It should. They stood in front of the cordwood wall together for a moment. 2 women in summer looking at a thing built to defeat winter. The kind of object that looks simple when it's done and is not simple at all in the getting there. How'd it do? Valdez asked. 47 inside when it was 30 below outside. She paused. I don't know what I'd have done last winter without the guide. Valdez thought about the guide that hadn't existed until she wrote a letter in February, about the letter that hadn't existed until Dewey Cass's report, about the report that hadn't existed until she kept 61 days of temperature logs, about the logs that hadn't existed until her father showed her that the record was the argument. Everything connected to everything before it. Ida made it through another winter, and another after that. Her lungs were bad and getting worse, but they were not the emergency they should have been statistically for a woman of her age and condition in a Montana winter. The shell cabin kept the temperature steady. Steady was what Ida's lungs needed. Steady was what they got. She died in 1952 in March, in a room that was 61 degrees, in her own bed, in her own house. That was not a small thing. Milo grew up watching his aunt fill notebooks and answer letters and check vents and measure gaps. He grew up knowing that the thing that keeps you warm in winter is nothing. Dead air, still space, a gap between the cold outside and the warmth inside that looks like absence and is the whole of the solution. He would say this later when he was older and someone asked him what she had taught him. He would say, she taught me that the most important thing in a wall is what isn't there. And then he would have to explain what that meant, and explaining it was the point which she had also taught him. The shell still stands. It is not famous. It has no designation, no historical marker, no name beyond what the extension guide records. It is a Quonset shell on a property in Flathead County, Montana, built in the fall of 1947 by a 47-year-old widow with borrowed tools and a 2-page explanation of dead air physics that she had been carrying in her memory for 28 years without knowing she would need it. It stands because the steel was good and the frame was sound and the principle was correct. It stands because she measured twice, because she built the baffles right, because she kept the records and wrote the letter and climbed the icy stairs and put her name on the document. And somewhere tonight in Montana or Idaho or Wyoming or Alaska, in some version of the design that has evolved and adapted and been rebuilt in new materials, in new places, a family is warm in a way they would not be without what she figured out in a cold room in November 1947. They don't know her name. Most of them don't. And she would not have cared about that exactly. She would have cared that they were warm. She would have cared that the knowledge moved. She would have cared that somewhere a notebook was open on a table and a woman was writing down numbers in the dark, keeping the record building, the argument doing the work that looks invisible until the winter comes and proves it wasn't. The wind moves over the shell and finds no grip. The steel turns it, deflects it. The air inside the gap sits perfectly still, 24 inches. That's all it is. 2 feet of nothing between the cold and the warmth. And in that nothing in that gap, everything she understood about heat and cold and time and what it means to finish something someone you loved was only beginning. All of it held still,